Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome Hector Garcia as our speaker this week. Hector is an expert in international investment, marketing, trade, and intercultural relations. He's worked in big industries such as Wells Fargo and with the NGO communities such as the National Conference for Community and Justice and the Twin Cities Immigrant Community Roundtable, both in the US. He developed the idea of cultural complementarity that helps humanity better understand and manage perceived differences as complementary in the pursuit of common goals, and he wrote a book about it. Today, he will provide his insights into ways we might better cope with our polycrisis. The floor is now yours, Hector.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you, Art, and thank you all at CACOR. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you have a lot of answers when we conclude. The last screen contains several books that I would recommend you consider reading, or at least read the reviews, and those can be sent to you immediately after the presentation. So I won't be doing much mention of statistics and data that probably many of you know, because it's all available in the books that I'm recommending to you. So the title of the presentation, as you know, is Intergenerational Alliances to Counter the Silo Mindset on Economic Growth, which is antagonizes humanity, nature, and reason. You all know, you're very familiar with today's crises that are listed on this screen. Global warming effects, pandemics, wars and personal mass shootings, massive migration, the trend towards autocracy instead of democracy, the latest uncertainty over the financial system internationally, and a great deal of despair, especially among the young and the old, over the situation, incremental addiction to drugs, suicide, division, enmity, and hate. So it's rather unpleasant to view this on the news constantly, and hopefully you will find what I'm going to present useful and helpful in alleviating the concerns over these crises. They're not new, as I imagine you all know. There's a great book that was written by a Stanford historian, Walter Scheidel, called The Great Leveler, which is rather long. He did intense research on how these crises are recurrent throughout human history. And he went back quite a bit to prehistoric times, to the Stone Age, and found that every time that humans exercise too much inequality on the masses of humanity, we have a great impact on what happens when we throw things out of balance. Scheidel refers to the fourth horseman of leveling the earth back to semi-normal, mass mobilization, warfare, transformative revolutions, state collapse, and catastrophic plagues, which eventually destroy the fortunes of the rich. But first, I'd like to present the context in which we live, which started in the early 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Peterson Institute for International Economics in 2019 defined globalization as the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. You'll notice that the human factor is included significantly in this definition. Cultures, populations, flows of people, yet the human factor has been the least considered in the current and early stages of globalization because it causes the most resistance and fear. That has led us to use a silo mindset, and the Nobel Prize economist Joseph Stiglitz said that he thinks it was one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of economists have made, a point of looking for a single answer. It kind of reminds me of Herbert Marcuse's book in the 1960s, The One-Dimensional Man. I don't know if you remember that. And another Nobel Prize, this time in science, Konrad Lorenz said, every man gets a narrower and narrower field of knowledge in which he must be an expert in order to compete with other people. The specialist knows more and more about less and less, and finally knows everything about nothing. I'll also remind you of something that the US Treasury Secretary Geithner said during an interview in 2011 in reference to the 2008-2009 catastrophe in the global financial system. So a couple of years later, he's referring to the relationship with China. He said, our second objective is to promote reforms that will reduce China's reliance on export-led growth and encourage a focus on domestic consumption. So now we find that there are billions around the world keeping up with the Joneses. It's something that I believe has a lot to do with our current situation. This was brought about in particular by the trends of reductionism and positivism, which in the early 19th century began to overtake the age of reflection. You might recall that that was also called Romanticism. And on the basis of the natural sciences, reductionism and positivism have claimed that it is mainly the measurable materialistic reality that truly exists. Thus, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, wealth, and power during one's lifetime increasingly are becoming the primary values. Although now with global climate findings by natural science, it is now being questioned because it conflicts with the profits of the fossil fuel industry. Reductionism and positivism have relegated religion, the arts, and then the social sciences to what are condescendingly considered to be soft values, not to be taken very seriously, if at all. So the humanities have increasingly been disregarded. I'll use Albert Einstein's quotes quite a few times because I found his genius to be very helpful in getting us to look at the direction that we might prefer to follow. So he said, shame on those scientists who are unwilling to embrace the importance of philosophers, particularly striking that he, being a physicist, would side with the philosophers and the religious leaders of his time. inequality has been agreed upon by several leading economists and other social observers to be the origin of the crises that we're living. It's not a new story. Hubris and greed have repeatedly undone the progress that we've achieved in the struggle for truth through religion, the sciences, and the arts. Joseph Stiglitz, again, said that money talks, gets to make all the rules. Oil companies and other corporations get gifts in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year in corporate welfare through special benefits hidden in the tax code. He advises that we need comprehensive policies. We need new political approaches. We haven't given sufficient attention to future generations. We're not thinking of future generations, and I think young people sense that very clearly. We need oversight to make sure about what we do. And I was reminded also of Gandhi's statement that there is enough for everyone's need on earth, but not for everyone's greed. Kenneth Bach, in the Human Nature Mythology book, said that we have been quick to seek explanations of our problems and failures in what we are instead of what we do. We seem wedded to the belief that our situation is a consequence of our nature rather than our historical acts. So Bill Gates made a great point in telling us that we were looking at the complex global reality that we ourselves constructed through a microscope instead of a telescope. And if we keep doing that, we will not understand the context in which we're living, and we will be unable to connect the dots so that we can see how to address the inconsistencies that keep cropping up. In my book, Clash or Complement of Cultures, I dedicated one full chapter to our blind spots. I think it's self-evident that all humans have blind spots. And my opinion is that our blind spots are huge. And so one of the results of those blind spots, if we don't acknowledge them and don't factor them in, is that we'll start putting the cart before the horse, as we're doing right now. Daniel Kahneman, the famous psychologist who's written excellent books, he said, are we sometimes so blind to our own blindness? He's not the first one to say that. Many people throughout history have repeatedly told us that. We have chosen to be blind or indifferent to the vital resources of human dignity, human agency, human history, and nature, as well as not assigning to them their rightful precedence over what we've been calling the machine of the economy, the machine of the markets. Peter Senge pointed out that we don't see how we contribute to our own problems and how those evolve through a slow and gradual process because we have been trained to see in isolated near-term events and to solve urgent problems, not policy questions. So it's fairly evident in watching the news or in dialogues and interviews that we keep focusing on symptoms, on tactical measures, and regrets of the situation that we find ourselves in, but they're not very strategic and even less paradigmical. Viktor Frankl, the famous author of Man's Search for Meaning, who lived through the Holocaust and in the concentration camps, learned what it was that made some people survive and most people die over the tragedy that they were experiencing. So one of the things that he said is, if we present the man with the concept of man, which is not true, we may well corrupt them. When we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instinct, heredity, and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I don't know if you heard or read the speech that one of the last speeches that Robert Kennedy did to a group of students in an American university, in which he talked about GDP and made the excellent point that it describes a lot of things in terms of products and services and trade, but it says nothing about what it is that makes humans brilliant and what brings their excellence about. Strangely enough, we're keeping, someone is keeping Einstein's brain preserved to find out what it is that made him a genius. You'll later see that I quote him to say that he did not consider him to be a genius, and made some aspirational observations to us that I think should be seriously considered. But I'm firmly convinced that nothing will be found in a dead brain. But that is our focus. Our focus is on material things exclusively. We have created the world that we live in, according to Einstein. And it will not be changed unless we change our thinking, not our physical aspects. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. A very pertinent comment now that leaders are discussing publicly the possibility of nuclear war. All religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree, said Einstein. All these aspirations are directed towards ennobling man's life, lifting it from the sphere of mere physical existence and leading the individual towards freedom. But we seem very immersed in the idea that our economy, our growth economy, will be perpetual at the expense of nature and human beings. Vaclav Smith, a Czech-Canadian environmental scientist, in one of his books, complains that economists haven't grasped the synergistic functioning of civilization and the biosphere, yet they maintain a monopoly on supplying their physically impossible narratives of continuing growth that guide decisions made by national governments and companies. That's not new either. You know, Leonardo da Vinci said, "O ye seekers after perpetual motion, how many vain chimeras have you pursued? Go and take your place with the alchemists." I think that applies to the economists that think that the growth economy can be perpetual. So why have we focused mainly on the material? Why have we focused mainly on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is one of the pillars of capitalism? When his more famous book at the time of his life, and what made him famous and affluent, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which you rarely hear anything about. And young people who are studying economics probably don't know what it's about. But it was exactly the balancing agent to his wealth of nation principles. In that book, Adam Smith explained that self-deceit is the fatal weakness of mankind and the source of half the disorders of human life. I think that speaks loudly to our situation today, our lack of balance and excess, our huge inequality that keeps growing by leaps and bounds. Conrad Lawrence said, the competition between human beings destroys with cold and diabolic brutality. Under the pressure of the competitive fury, we have not only forgotten what is useful to humanity as a whole, but even that which is good and advantageous to the individual. One asks, what is more damaging to modern humanity, the thirst for money or consuming haste? In either case, fear plays a very important role. The fear of being overtaken by one's competitors, the fear of becoming poor, the fear of making wrong decisions, or the fear of not being up to snuff. Civilization and truth are in a very precarious state at this moment. At a recent CACOR talk where I participated, it was mentioned that there are famous economists who claim that we should not be concerned about natural resources because they can be recreated by human imagination. I asked you to look up the project Biosphere 2. We can not only dismiss the idea that we can automatically replace natural resources with our imagination, but look at a real precedent in Arizona where millions of dollars were invested to try to create a small ecosystem under a bubble with, I believe it was 8 scientists, men and women, that failed miserably. Right here on Earth, we were unable to do that, having all that nature offers us surrounding those scientists and that bubble. Well, it worked so poorly that the scientists started sneaking out of the bubble and bringing in resources that they were missing in order to prove that they could do it. The thing failed twice, and now I read that it's being revived by Steve Bannon. Not much can be expected from that project, and even less from the other one of reimagining natural resources. As far as human resources, there's a very famous historian, Yuval Noah Harari, whose books have been selling more than 20 million copies. He was invited to speak to the world's leadership at the World's Economic Forum of 2023, this year, in Davos, Switzerland, who also advises us not to worry too much about human resources. Why? The outcome of humans learning to engineer bodies, brains, and minds will be the main product of the economy of the 21st century, he says. Over the past century, humankind has managed to do the impossible. Famine, plague, and war have been transformed from incomprehensible and uncontrollable forces of nature into manageable challenges. You know, I really wonder what world he's living in when he dares say that to the global leadership at Davos. He said, humankind will turn itself into God. He wrote a book called Homo Deus, where he says that there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. So that is the hubris, the arrogance that we're facing in trying to understand reality. Voltaire, during the French Revolution, said, "Those who can make you believe the absurdities will make you commit atrocities," as did happen then and has happened repeatedly, and we're verging on doing it more and more with the wars that have been unfolding for decades. Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, said something very intriguing about our capacity to create. I think it says something about human nature that the only form of life we have created so far is purely destructive. We have created life in our own image. So how Harari and others are telling us we're going to do these grandiose things is quite beyond me. But Eric Fromm, the famous psychotherapist, said something in relation to that. He said, our conscious motivations, ideas, and beliefs are blends of false information, biases, irrational passions, rationalizations, prejudice, in which morsels of truth swim around and give the reassurance, albeit false, that the whole mixture is real and true. Our thinking processes attempt to organize this whole cesspool of illusions according to the laws of plausibility. This level of consciousness is supposed to reflect reality. It is the map we use for organizing our life. Not a very aspirational statement, I would say. So how can we change the situation, which is the main focus of this presentation? You all are familiar with the crises, but I felt it was necessary to connect the dots. So in order to harness globalization, what I have been proposing, and many others have as well, I'll quote something from a beautiful documentary called Nature that PBS did recently, in which the commentator, who was quite a poet, said in regards to the young eagle who was going to leap out into space for the first time from its nest in the European Alps. The commentator said, to leap from the barriers of a single point of view to an explosion of multiple perspectives is probably the scariest moment for that young eagle's life. And that is inspirational, I think, and that's why we often think of eagles when we dare to do things that seem impossible to us. But to do things that are impossible, we need to learn from our context. We need to learn from the reality that we ourselves have experienced, have created, and from the history that humanity has also created in the past, and from which we can derive lessons. And it is not arrogance and bravado and hubris that will give us the answer. It's the kind of humility that Isaac Newton and many other scientists and people we consider geniuses have said. You know, he didn't say, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. He said, if I see further, it is because I stood on the shoulders of giants. That's the kind of spirit that we need. Great men are they who see that spiritual is stronger than any material force, that thoughts rule the world. That was said by Ralph Emerson, one of the advocates of romanticism in the age of reflection. So to connect the dots, we have to look at things in their proper proportion through the proper perspective. And I'll quote again Albert Einstein: computers are incredibly fast, accurate, but stupid. Human beings are incredibly slow, inaccurate, and brilliant. Together, they are powerful beyond our imagination. But it's not only Einstein, whom some of you might say, well, he lived decades ago. What does he know about computers? I'll tell you what Gillian Tett, the editor at large of the Financial Times in the US, said on March 19, 2023. The point, and this was in reference to the banking crisis that we're beginning to experience now and probably will repeat 2008 and 2009, according to Nouriel Roubini, who was one of the few that predicted the crisis of 2008. So Gillian Tett said, the point is that many people who are supposedly some of the brightest people in America working in Silicon Valley turned out to be unbelievably stupid when it came to looking at basic finance and banking. And earlier in her interview, she said, credit is derived from the Latin for trust, but we haven't focused on trust. Remember, we did away with the humanities. So I'll mention a quote that Art Hunter had asked me to send to him recently. It is from Lila Watson, an indigenous Australian visual artist and activist, an academic who said it at the 1985 United Nations Decade for Women conference in Nairobi. But it wasn't just her statement. It was part of an Aboriginals rights group in Queensland who came together and came up with the phrase. The phrase is directed towards Europeans who were coming to help them. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. It's humanity that's in the mess that we're in. It's not one group of elites and what is now called the best and the brightest telling the rest of humanity what they should do. We're all in need of learning. So is there an option to the rat race and the self-abasement that we've been involved in for so long? I'll remind you that Tertullian in the 3rd century said, the scourges of pestilence, famine, wars, and earthquakes have come to be regarded as a blessing to overcrowded nations, since they serve to prune away the luxuriant growth of the human race. Well, you know, at that time, from the 2nd to the 4th century, there were a total of about 250 million people on Earth. And we were already saying that there wasn't enough for all of us, and therefore we had to commit brutality and wars to bring about some balance. Albert Camus, the famous French philosopher, said, man, because he was living in the 60s, let's say Homo sapiens is the only creature that refuses to be what he is. What does he mean by that? Eric Fromm said that humanity are the freaks of the universe because we insist on not being who we are. We keep trying to make ourselves the same in appearance. We try to be grandiose and not find our place in the universe. and realize our enormous potential. What is that potential? That of being princes, like Canadian psychiatrist Eric Byrne told us. We are born princes and princesses, but the civilizing process makes us frogs. Tom Piketty recently said in his brief history of equality that we need to resist historical amnesia and the temptations of cultural separatism and intellectual compartmentalization. At stake is the quality of life for billions of people. We know we can do better. In his book, A Brief History of Equality, he said, the past shows us how. The future is up to us. It's not unlike what Martin Luther King said to us. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So what do we want to choose? Do we want to keep choosing grandiosity? Do we want our kids to jump off of buildings, putting on a cape of Superman and thinking that they're going to be fine? That's actually what we do. They learned that kind of grandiosity from us. They didn't learn it on their own. So what I propose to you is that this is the real creation, not the one that Harari is talking about through artificial intelligence. And the question is, do we want to be part of that co-creation? Do we want true grandeur, or do we want to keep being grandiose? So I believe that we can aspire to live a heroic life. Einstein again said, I am not a genius. I am just curious. I ask many questions, and when the answer is simple, then God is answering. He went on to say, the efforts of most human beings are consumed in the struggle for their daily bread. But most of those who are either through fortune or some special gift relieved of this struggle are largely absorbed in further improving their worldly lot. Beneath this effort directed towards the accumulation of worldly good lies all too frequently the illusion that this is the most substantial and desirable end to be achieved. Fortunately, there is a minority composed of those who recognize early in their lives that the most beautiful and satisfying experiences open to humankind are not derived from the outside, but are bound with the development of the individual's own feeling, thinking, and acting. The genuine artists, investigators, and thinkers, of which he was one, have always been persons of this kind. However, inconspicuously, the life of these individuals runs its course. Nonetheless, the fruit of their endeavors are the most valuable contributions that they can make to humanity. So finally, in aspiring towards that goal, I will leave a takeaway with you for you to reflect on, and I'll send you a couple of articles that I've written on this subject. How can we get started to think in a different way, to look at reality instead of what the silo mindset is telling us to look at? And I referred to it in the title as the intergenerational alliances. I was talking about a Generation Z Elders Alliance, illustrated, for example, by Attenborough and Greta Thunberg on global climate change. I'll tell you a little bit about it. The members of Generation Z, who go from 10 years old to 25, and retired elders like us, are less subject to the bias of vested interests than the rest of us. They are free to see more objectively and broadly via their hearts and their minds the perils beyond the cliff's edge that we're approaching, to which our society is rushing. Elders prioritize their legacy to the next generation, and the dire consequences to their own grandchildren will suffer. Generation C visualizes with anxiety, as Greta Thunberg and many others have expressed, the future world to which they're being led to subsist. These two unlikely allies are discovering that they're not helpless. Instead, they're identifying complementary resources to be harnessed in pursuit of a more auspicious future. Generation C has the physical energy, the emotional intensity, and the skills to utilize modern technology. Elders have the now rare wisdom and knowledge of history, along with a lifetime of experience. Together, the combination of these resources is unique in today's society, and their complementarity can generate the synergies required concretely through examples of this developing bi-generational alliances, which keep cropping up here and there in various nations. So that's the list of books that I'm recommending that you consider reading. And with that, I'll pause for questions.
Thank you very much, Hector. I'd like to make a couple of observations first, and then I do have a question for you, followed by Art Hunter. My first observation is that I thought the definition you found from the Peterson Institute on globalization was really, really good. Best one I've ever seen. Secondly, you kind of touched on one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein, and I thought it was very relevant to the idea of complementarity, which I find refreshingly unique. He either said this or is reputed to have said this, and perhaps not in these exact words. The thinking that got us into this mess won't get us out of it. And I think that's very relevant right now, because we do seem to be intent on going down the same old well-trodden path. So now here's my question, and perhaps your quote from Tertullian in the 3rd century is directly related to this. I'm wondering if you think this is one of our blind spots, since you raised it that way. Why do we limit the social safety net, but not the corporate safety net? For the social safety net, we have all kinds of qualifications, such as you have to prove you don't have any assets. We have clawbacks if you have too much income. We have tiered taxation, and we have surtaxes. But it seems really none of that applies, especially to big industry. So do you think that this is a blind spot?
Well, yes, it's a huge blind spot that particularly the wealthy and powerful have had throughout history, because we have a great power to choose, in contradiction to what many natural scientists are telling us, that it's all chemistry. I think our power to choose is enormous, and the people who are influential exercise it to their advantage. Reading the book by Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is very helpful in that regard, to see how leaders have chosen to focus on the wealth of nations, and how self-enrichment is terrific, but have made no mention of moral sentiments, because it doesn't help them disguise their self-deceit, which is one of the key messages of Adam Smith in that book. So it's choice. I believe that we're blind because we choose to be blind. Many people throughout history have told us that the key to everything is seeing, the willingness to see, the willingness to open our eyes, like Galileo said. So the reason is simply that the powerful deceive us into thinking that there is no option but the deterministic option of doing what they want us to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it points out to the fact that when conservatives, who are largely the people doing this, say, we have to limit what goes out in the social safety net, they're not saying the same thing about what goes out in the corporate safety net. But anyway, thank you very much for your answer. Next, going to go to Art Hunter, followed by Paul Beckwith. I know you had a comment. I assume you still want to get in to make that comment.
Yeah, I guess, Hector, I want to say I'm certainly going to come back and I'm going to listen to your presentation again. It was so rich in content. I'm sure a second view will really drive home many of the very content-filled quotes that you've presented to us, and I'm sure John Hollins will be interested in all those as well. One of the things you did say, which immediately got my attention, when you mentioned the name Steve Bannon. And that just, I hadn't heard that name in some time. And the fact that he's often interested in developing an experiment where people are living in a bubble. I'm really interested in this because, number one, I don't trust Bannon. He's got some ulterior motive, which I don't think is really going to be helpful to all of mankind. That's how much I respect anything he says and does. Do you know anything about this experiment and what his objectives really are?
Well, Biosphere 2 was an effort to demonstrate that through science, we could create ecosystems that would be self-dependent, and with the ultimate objective of sometimes setting up one like it in another planet, if we ever decided that we needed to move to another planet. The terrible thing that happened was that they didn't realize that it's not science that determines our long-term survival, but the ability to communicate with each other and to work together to bring about the great discoveries that we have in the past. And so the scientists inside started to fight the way we've always been fighting throughout the history of humanity. And before we started globalization, which was our doing, it didn't come from outer space. We started globalization, primarily the wealthy nations. We should have thought first about the fact that we don't know how to get along with each other. So instead of doing first and thinking later about the terrible consequences, we should have thought first and then acted. But now we have to catch up. Now we have to do what we should have done in the beginning, which is to try and improve our communication, not technological communication. I will add that Albert Einstein also said, if technological communication continues to grow without human communication growing in tandem, we will breed a generation of idiots. He was rather harsh about that. We need human communication to improve the way we work with one another. So in any case, Bannon has taken up this biosphere II, I wouldn't give much hope to that effort because he failed recently with his other one in Rome to try to bring down the Catholic Church and the Pope. He was, pretty much expelled from Rome and Europe because they consider him the most dangerous American that has ever gone to Europe. I don't know if that answers your question.
I agree that he's a very dangerous American. Anyway, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Interesting question and comment. Okay, I'd like to go to Paul Beckwith, followed by Ted Manning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hector. Very fascinating talk. And, I'll scrutinize your book list, and, I'm familiar with lots of them, but I don't know if you've got Douglas Rushkoff's book, which came out recently on there. Probably not. It's called Survival of the Richest, Escape Fantasies of the Billionaires. So they're, distorted utopian fantasies of somehow escaping, civilizational collapse, buying a remote desert island somewhere, or remote tropical island rather somewhere, or putting bunkers in New Zealand, etc. I think one of the recurring themes of your talk is that there's lots of very good quotes from scientists like Albert Einstein. I love his quotes in particular, but Carl Sagan has a lot. There's a lot of scientists over the years that have had quite a bit of wisdom about the human condition, and it seems to me that another recurring theme is that it's the economists that are have way too much power, right? They have, and the inequality. Money-wise, we've got the three wealthiest billionaires could easily pay for the entire U.S. Military budget in a year. So the inequalities, are enormous. So it seems to me that there's some very simple solutions that could work, and one of them is putting a cap on what people can own. A cap on wealth and how much one can earn. Like why do we have so many billionaires and multimillionaires? And the corporations are treated as people. They like to be treated as people and have human rights, yet they pay next to no taxes. So there's some very fundamental things that we could do. It just needs the willpower of some governments to enforce those things. And it seems that the governments are just beholden to lobbyists, and many people in government are lawyers. So if we could get rid of the economists and the lawyers running society, do you think that would go a long way to addressing these issues? It's not what you or I or the average person thinks. It's the people that are in charge, and their training just isn't the right type of training to have empathy for their fellow humans.
If I may, Paul, I thank you for the question. I have not read the book you mentioned. I'll if you send it by chat, I'll do so. But in answer to your question, I avoid trying to focus on tactical measures and on symptoms, because I think that's part of the strategy to lead us astray. Everybody's so mired in the thousands of things that are going wrong that they're totally confused. I mean, children are actually committing suicide in unprecedented numbers because they're confused. And they're afraid. They're afraid for their future. The reason why I use so many quotes is because, as Einstein said in that very long quote at the end, the answers are there from people whom we call geniuses, discoverers, privileged individuals, saints. They have told us throughout history what the way to look at things really should be. The greatest voyage of discovery is seeing through new eyes, is one of dozens that I could repeat for you. But until we start looking at things in a larger deeper perspective, not in a narrow, superficial one, we'll never do anything. Thoreau said something brilliant. He said, if we live such a mean life, it is because our vision does not go beyond the surface. So if we keep looking for answers, but we're looking through a microscope, we're never going to come up with any answers. It's impossible. So the answer to your question is everybody needs to start looking at the bigger, deeper picture.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Hector. And good question, Paul. I'd like to go now to Ted Manning, followed by Jean Doherty, who's actually sitting beside me. So I'll just swing my screen when it's time.
Thank you, Hector. You're really making us think, which is challenging. We've been working in the Club of Rome and in CACOR for a while, trying to find more holistic approaches. And a couple of things that came to mind when hearing you talk was we've come to the conclusion that we have forgotten where we came from, in a sense that we are not part of the ecosystem, and we can operate apart from it, and the limits and positioning of humanity is not relevant. And secondly, we've come to the conclusion that the world and the future is a zero-sum game, and only the most vicious vipers can escape from the pit. Now, those are rather negative things, but I'm wondering, how do we get out of that? What knowledge, and how can we, in fact, affect that knowledge so that people stop looking only at, well, the term we've been fighting is he who dies with the most stuff wins.
Right. I think that's a Forbes quote,
Yeah.
which is valued highly by his family and by many people.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're playing games is basically what we're doing, and the stakes are enormous. You know, when we talk about nuclear war and the effects of global climate change, we decide that it's a good thing to lie instead of to continue pursuing the truth. We're playing games. So in answer to your question, thank you for asking, and I'm glad you're in a tropical area back there.
I wish I was. I'm in the snow in Ottawa. I'm faking. It's all fake news.
Well, it's not all fake news. I think there are still people who value the truth, who are struggling to continue pursuing the truth so that we can understand reality better. And what all of these geniuses and discoverers and privileged human beings, saints, have told us, it's the way we think that leads us in one direction or another. If we choose to see only the superficial, to think that the earth is flat because that's the way it looks, we're always going to come up with the wrong answers. It is only when we start looking in depth at things that scare us because it's dark, that's where we don't want to go. We really like to talk about how well the economy is doing, how well technology is doing, because we can all touch it, we can all feel it. It's what distracts young people, unfortunately, from pursuing the things that are hard to find. But it is that difficulty, the suffering itself, that would lead us in the right direction. We have to visualize in a different way, and we have to think in a different way.
Thank you very much, Hector.
You're welcome.
Okay, over to Jean Doherty, followed by John Hollins.
And there's another hand up, Derek Paul, I think. Go ahead.
Thank you, Hector. That was a very, very interesting presentation, and it got me thinking in so many different directions. So that I really, really appreciate that. But immediately upon listening to what you were saying, it struck me square between the eyes. And I may be saying something here that might be quite controversial to most of the men here, but I do think that a lot of the terms and things that you were talking about are the softer viewpoints, empathy, looking into intergenerational things. Those are issues that most women are thinking about throughout their lives and their careers. That's a generality, but I do think that that's something that we need to look at. And with respect to how we can move forward from here, looking at the perspective of what the next generation, and as the Indigenous peoples of North America say, 7 generations down, might give us a different perspective. I also think that as men in particular have aged and become part of the elder group, they start seeing that perspective as well. So women tend to see that perspective throughout their lives, and it can cause both conflict and problems. It's difficult to get their voices heard at a time when they should be having the most power, whereas the power of men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s is almost overwhelming. So is it possible for us as a human race to actually start using the softer viewpoint that might be available, using other viewpoints other than the male-dominated one that we have right now?
Thank you for the great answer, Jean. And interestingly enough, you hit the nail on the head, because that's what complementarity is about, is having multiple perspectives, leaping into the explosion of multiple perspectives, as that nature documentary said. It is very unfortunate that the people in power have exclusively appropriated what is true and valuable for society for millennia, and that we continue doing it at the expense of humanity and at the expense of nature. Fortunately, we're having a lot of new leaders who are women, some indigenous leaders across the world. That's the reason why I quoted Watson from Australia and her fantastic notion. We have to realize that helping one another, the common good, is not a burden. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to help one another, because we are the greatest assets available to us. And we sacrifice both human beings and natural resources so that a few might be more powerful and wealthy. It doesn't make any sense. So I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think the doorway is to look through that telescope. We confirmed that everything is interdependent. That little bit natural sciences has proven. Now we have to understand that human beings are interdependent, that the natural ecosystems are interdependent, and think and act accordingly. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Hector. Very much appreciate that.
Okay, so we're going to go to John Hollins, followed by Peter Bulkowski.
Thank you, Hector, for your wide-ranging and deep talk. On the point you made in answering Jean, The Economist recently published an article about the glass ceiling, which suggested on their measures of 8 factors, the progress between a better balance between males and females is going better than I realized. I hope they're right. Hector, you talked about alliance between elderly folks, which is almost everybody in CACOR, and much younger people. CACOR over the years has made occasional efforts, very modest, I'd have to say, to recruit more younger members, but just to sort of have a broader general conversation with the idea of an alliance doing something between Gen Z and elders. You've upped the ante considerably. You gave an example of Greta, and I think, was it Sir Richard Attenborough? have you any other examples of effective alliances between folks my age and very much younger ones?
Yes, I think of a couple right away at St. Catherine's University here in Minnesota. There's one such alliance called Nuns, N-U-N-S, and Nones, N-O-N-E-S. Nuns are the young women who are dropping away from their faith because they're desperate. You know, they're not everybody, but too many young people are abandoning not only trust in institutions, but faith as well. And in my opinion, the stars of our faith and our trust need to be strengthened and pursued. Otherwise, if there's no hope in life, as many of them say, is why continue living? So I can send you a couple of others if you like. I'll send it to Dave and Art, and they can disseminate them. And I would be hopeful that things are moving in the right direction, as the French economist Piketty pointed out in one of those last quotes that I read about his recent book on equality, which is by far more auspicious than the previous one that made him famous. And also what Martin Luther King said about the arc of the moral universe, progressing slowly, but bending in the direction of justice. I think there is hope, but we need to start thinking in a better way instead of giving up.
Thank you.
Okay, so over to Peter Bolkowski, followed by Phil Riley and Derek Paul after that.
Hi, Peter Bolkowski here. I'm the sort of odd man out. I'm a petroleum man, 45 years in the oil and gas industry, mostly oil sands. I'm also of Ukrainian ancestry. We have seen roughly three times in the last 100 years attempts by Russian governments to commit genocide of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian people. In the Amazon intro to your book, there is a comment that says interdependence will not work if winning is the only thing mindset continues to prevail in the US and the West. What changes do you see are required in non-West, such as Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, as examples?
Thank you for your question. It's a very good one. The game of winning is the only thing, or the game of one-upmanship, paint us into a corner constantly, and they have done so for millennia. And they will continue to be the case unless we start thinking and acting and speaking differently. You're describing circumstances and situations that didn't appear from nowhere. In the case of Ukraine, not only Europe, but also the US kept poking the bear of Russia for a long time after they had agreed that NATO would not expand close to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. That does not justify the reaction by the Russians and Putin in any way. The thing is that we have to stop playing the game of tit for tat, because we keep multiplying the terrible consequences that the whole world has to pay. And for every one of those cases that you described, I can tell you what the origins of those situations were that become intractable. In my opinion, it's prevention that we can impact. We can do something to change the growth of the tree, so to speak, that we don't like when it's a sapling or when we're planting the seed, not once it's grown and say, oh, too bad, I didn't really want to have the tree grow in that direction. It's too late. You don't correct things, whether it be individuals or nations, once they've reached a state of collapse, such as the one that Russia and Ukraine are involved in.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, we'll go over to Phil Riley, followed by Derek Paul and David Pollock after that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation. The comment about Biosphere 2 really struck a chord with me. I don't know how many people have been in Biosphere 2. About a dozen years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a few hours there on a guided tour, and it was very interesting to note all of the biological and horticultural and water purification systems that they had put into Biosphere 2. And it was basically an experiment to see how people could survive in complete isolation and try to, I guess, form a family, if you like. But I'm not sure what the mixture of male and female scientists were in Biosphere 2. And I also am curious if you know how long the project was to last, because the walkout, and I forget whether it was the women that walked out or a man that walked out, within a 2-year period of, and I think it was about a decade, that these people were supposed to stay together and develop a very small culture of people that had specialization in different areas. It was an experiment from my point of view, which was doomed to fail from the very beginning because the selection process did not choose wisely amongst the people that were to be the experiential benefactors and promoters of what was possible in the future.
So is that a comment or you want an answer?
I was wondering about the knowledge that you had in your sort of very quick mention of Biosphere 2.
Well, what struck me the most about Biosphere 2 is the reason why it failed. One, for thinking that only scientists should be in there. That's part of the problem. That's a silo mindset that we lean towards that does not produce the right thing. You reminded me of something that happened when Kennedy was elected as president, and LBJ was commenting to somebody how brilliant the team that he put together was, and what is now called the best and the brightest. And the person that LBJ was talking to said, well, I'd feel a lot better if there was one sheriff among them, because the sheriff is in touch with reality, is an average human being dealing with human flaws and trying to address them. So this thing that the best and the brightest should lead us in the right direction is something that I totally disagree with. Actually, the term started to be used in a cynical way, in a sarcastic way, because they were the ones that led the world into the Vietnam War. So we need everyone, as Stephen Hawking, himself a great scientist, said, the new dialogue has to be among all human beings, not the best and the brightest.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers my question, but anyway.
Well, you wanted to know why it didn't succeed. It didn't succeed because it used the silo mindset.
Yeah.
scientists who are going to recreate something that they were not able to do even on Earth. So could they do it on the moon or on Mars? I very much doubt it. I don't think there's any hope for that at all.
That's more to my point.
Okay.
Yeah, I think also it was an incredibly complex system that they were attempting to reproduce, and they didn't have any way of understanding all the complexities that they were bound to miss because they were modeling, and models are not reality. Anyway, okay.
Well, we'll leave it up to Steve Bannon to show them the way.
Yeah, he'll definitely show us the right way not to do it. Okay, so over to Derek Paul, followed by David Pollock, and I don't have anybody else in line after that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I was just wanted to make a comment at the beginning that Jean Doherty's point was very well taken by me, at least, because Monday this week, I rewrote chapter 1 of my book to make exactly that point. And what I wanted to bring up was something that I haven't heard mentioned this afternoon, and that is paradigm. And I have a friend who is very strong on that, and she happens to be female and was able to bring the duality between male and female into the paradigm. But she and I revised our paper 2.5 years ago, and it's called the title, I mean, is the essential.
I'm just up next, dear.
The essential new paradigm, and I just wanted to bring that up.
March 30th.
Okay, what the essential paradigm is, it's putting life first, putting life of the ecosphere first. And if you do that, and a lot of people have not done it, but the ones who have, it really changes their life. And we have the vast majority of business people and national leaders and possibly the lawyers that somebody else referred to earlier today, they haven't. But for those who have done so, it just transforms life.
Well, thank you. I wish you success with your book. And I think paradigms that are inclusive, such as yours, are very important. That's why I also recommended Anthrovision, written by Gillian Tett, which recommends that the human perspective, not only the natural perspective, be offered. And mine is by no means the only one. Thank you. Dave?
Yes,
Great.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Dave Pollock.
Yeah, and thank you, Hector, very much for sparking the reflection and the conversation this afternoon. I'm not sure I have a question, but I have a comment or two, I think. What you made me think of was someone I studied years ago in the psychological field, Ernest Becker. And I remember a comment of his. It was something like, at any given moment, the ego, the personal ego, can become or remains the center of consciousness, but it does not need to remain the center of our personality. And it strikes me that we're venturing in areas of spirituality, not religion, but spirituality and psychology. And it also raises the question of ways of knowing and whether we can reason our way into solutions for the kind of dilemmas that we face today. And I was reminded of a kitchen table project of families in Sweden when they began to be aware of the negative consequences of commercial advertising and the hidden persuaders and the manipulation that went on of young children, prompting them to want all manner of consumer goods. And this kitchen project table began to have young children reflect with their families on what the advertisers were doing and making them aware. And it seems to me that some of the transition that needs to occur towards personalities not being as fearful with their small ego, but being linked to projects related to the common good, require this kind of widespread kitchen table reflection about the significance and the importance of the common good, so that we begin to have more possibilities of getting people less ego-centered in their personalities and much more centered on a transformative vision. And I'm just thinking that it's not economists or lawyers or people like ourselves, but it is indeed the kitchen table, family units at school age children that can begin to focus more on these projects of the common good. So I just wanted to say that those were a couple of the reflections that you led me to this afternoon. So thanks again.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I'll just comment that complementarity calls for all of us to contribute, because we all have not only the potential to contribute in each of our own spheres with each of our own talents and uniqueness, but we also all have the responsibility to contribute.
Totally agreed. Yes.
So if you check the list of books, you'll see that there are psychologists like Eric Fromm and his book Escape from Freedom. You know, I mentioned Eric Berne, Games People Play, and others who are essential to this process, because it's not only the natural scientists, but the social scientists that are vital to find the right multiple perspectives. So thanks for your comments.
And thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question from Raymond Lurie.
Hi, Hector. Very interesting presentation. You know, when I look at phenomena like QAnon and, you know, some of the disinformation we see out there, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about being able to create a similar phenomena, but this time producing, talking about real conspiracies, if you will, and talking about real stuff that's happening, and finding a way to get people to believe and to understand, you know, things like climate change and all that. Do you see any way of us being able to do something like that?
Certainly, great question. Thank you. I believe that, you know, everything that we have developed that can be considered progress and move towards better understanding of reality so that we can manage reality better is good. What I think we have done mistakenly is to assign the top priority to things that don't have the top priority. You know, I mentioned putting the cart before the horse. I think artificial intelligence is good, but it's a tool, it's not a master. And the idea that we use that very powerful tool so that people can consume more and approve or disapprove more of each other is a terrible use, because we don't have the right prioritization. It is the ideals of truth, of religion, of the arts that need to be guiding us, not the tools that guide us, not the things that impress us so much. The universe doesn't get impressed because we kill off thousands of people or millions of people. That's a foolish game that we play, you know, impressing each other. It's how can we contribute? Each one of us can be a genius. Each one of us can be a discoverer. But only if we realize that that's who we are. Our identity is not on the surface of our skin or the country that we go to or the country that we came from. It's how we think, how we see, how we speak, and how we act. And until we realize that, we're going to keep fighting over things that don't really make any sense.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Great. Okay, thank you, Hector. I'm going to pass this over to Jean to thank you on behalf of CACOR.
Before I do the actual thank you, there was one comment that was put up on the screen that we've been asked to read out rather than have the person say it. But Walter Kittle said, a great presentation and discussion. I think the overarching takeaway for me is that we need to put humanity back into humanity so that we can save humanity.
I like that. I like that. Thank you.
Okay. Anyway, with that, Hector, it is indeed my privilege and my pleasure to be able to thank you on behalf of the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. You have given us, as people have been saying, a very thought-provoking presentation, and one that I think many of us are going to take away and think about for a long time into the future. So thank you very much for that.
It's my privilege. Thank you.
And with that, I would like to say to those of you who are still here, please go to our website at canadiancore.com and look at the Stay Informed section, where you will be able to see this particular presentation when it becomes available on our YouTube site. On that website, you will also be able to see all the previous YouTubes for presentations that we have made, and it is searchable using the video link that we've got there. We are trying to make it so that people can see the vast wealth of information that we have there for people. If you are interested in becoming a member of the Club of Rome, we have information on our website about membership. And in addition to that, we also have, if you don't want to be a member but wish to support our efforts, you can make a donation to the Club of Rome or to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome as well. So with that, thank you again, Hector. This has been a great presentation.